Welcome to another journey through history, where we explore the fascinating world of medieval fashion and the clothing that adorned people across all levels of society. Tonight, we venture into the wardrobes of peasants and nobles, merchants and craftsmen, discovering how fabric and fashion told the story of medieval life. As we begin this exploration, imagine yourself walking through a bustling medieval town on a crisp morning. The cobblestone streets are alive with people from every walk of life, each dressed according to their station, their craft, and their means. From the simple linen shifts of working women to the silk-lined cloaks of nobility, every garment tells a story of social hierarchy, daily necessity, and human ingenuity. Medieval fashion was far more than mere covering for the body. It was a complex language of social communication, a system of signs and symbols that could reveal at a glance a person's wealth, occupation, marital status, and place in the rigid hierarchy of feudal society. The choice of fabric, the cut of a sleeve, the length of a hem, even the colour of thread used in embroidery, all conveyed precise meanings that were as clearly understood by medieval people as written words. The foundation of every medieval outfit, regardless of social class, began with the undergarments. Those intimate layers, hidden from view yet essential for comfort and propriety, formed the base upon which all other clothing was built. For women, the most fundamental garment was the chemise, also known as a shift or smock. This simple, loose-fitting garment was worn directly against the skin and served multiple crucial purposes in medieval life. The chemise was typically made of linen, a fabric prized for its softness against the skin and its ability to absorb moisture. For the wealthy, these undergarments might be crafted from the finest, almost transparent linen, sometimes even silk for the most privileged ladies of the court. For common women, the chemise would be made from coarser linen, still soft but more durable for everyday wear and frequent washing. The construction of a chemise was deceptively simple, yet ingeniously practical. Cut in a loose flowing shape that fell from the shoulders to anywhere from mid-thigh to ankle length, it provided a smooth foundation layer that prevented the rougher outer garments from chafing against delicate skin. The sleeves were typically long and loose, allowing for freedom of movement while providing coverage that was considered essential for modesty. What made the chemise particularly important was its role in medieval hygiene. While outer garments were rarely washed due to their expense and the labour-intensive nature of medieval laundry, the linen chemise could be washed regularly. It served as a protective barrier, absorbing perspiration and body oils that would otherwise soil the valuable outer garments. This practical function made the chemise an essential item even for women of modest means, who might own several chemises to allow for regular changing and washing. For men, the equivalent undergarment was equally important. Men wore brays, which resembled loose drawers or short pants, typically made of linen and reaching from the waist to mid-thigh or knee. These garments were secured at the waist with a drawstring and served much the same protective function as women's chemises. Over the brays, men wore an undertunic, a long shirt-like garment that extended to the knees or beyond. The undertunic was a crucial element in medieval men's dress, serving as both undergarment and, in some cases, as casual wear when working or when in private spaces. Made primarily of linen for its comfort and washability, the undertunic had long sleeves and was typically left loose and flowing. The neckline was simple, often with a small opening that could be secured with ties or left open for ventilation. The quality and decoration of these undergarments varied significantly with social status. Noble men and women might have their chemises and undertunics adorned with fine embroidery at the neckline, sleeves, and hem. These decorative elements, while usually hidden, served as a form of personal luxury and status symbol, even if only the wearer knew of their existence. Moving beyond the intimate foundation layers, we encounter the clothing of the working classes, the vast majority of medieval society who laboured in fields, workshops and households to sustain the feudal economy. The clothing of peasants and workers was governed by three primary considerations: durability, practicality, and economy. Every garment had to withstand hard physical labour, provide adequate protection from the elements, and be affordable to those with very limited means. For peasant women, the basic outer garment was a simple dress or gown, known as a cotte, worn over the linen chemise. This dress was typically made of wool, a fabric that provided warmth, durability, and some water resistance, essential qualities for women who worked outdoors in all weather conditions. The wool used for peasant clothing was usually of coarser quality, often in natural, undyed colours ranging from cream and grey to brown and dark grey, depending on the natural colour of the sheep's fleece. The construction of a peasant woman's dress was necessarily simple and practical. The garment was usually made from rectangular pieces of fabric sewn together with minimal shaping, making the most economical use of precious cloth. The sleeves were typically long but not fitted tightly, allowing for the free movement necessary for farm work, cooking, and household tasks. The skirt portion extended to the ankles, providing modesty and protection for the legs while still allowing for walking and working. Over this basic dress, working women almost invariably wore an apron, a crucial garment that served both practical and protective functions. Made of linen or sometimes leather for particularly messy work, the apron protected the dress from stains, sparks from the fire, and general wear and tear. The apron also provided convenient pockets or ties for holding small tools, herbs, or other necessities of daily work. The colours available to peasant women were limited to what could be produced locally using readily available plant and mineral dyes. Browns came from oak bark or walnut hulls, yellows from weld or saffron, reds from madder root, and blues from woad. These dyes, while not as vibrant or colour-fast as the expensive imported dyes used by the wealthy, still provided peasant clothing with pleasing earthy tones that connected the wearers to their natural environment. For peasant men, the basic outer garment was a tunic, a simple pullover garment that extended from the shoulders to somewhere between the mid-thigh and knee. Like women's dresses, men's tunics were made primarily of wool and were constructed for durability rather than fashion. The tunic was worn over the linen undertunic and braise, creating a layered system that provided warmth and protection. The length of a man's tunic was both practical and symbolic. Shorter tunics, ending at mid-thigh or just above the knee, were preferred by men who engaged in active physical labour, as the shorter length allowed for greater freedom of movement when bending, lifting, and working. However, even among the working classes, longer tunics were considered more dignified and were often reserved for special occasions or worn by men in slightly higher positions, such as skilled craftsmen or overseers. Male peasants also wore chausses or hose, which were essentially long stockings that covered the legs from foot to thigh. These were made of wool or linen and were tied to the braise or to a belt worn under the tunic. The hose served to keep the legs warm and provided a neat appearance, covering the legs completely even when the tunic was shorter. The footwear of working people was necessarily robust and practical. Peasant shoes were typically made of leather, often from cattle or pigs raised locally. The construction was simple but effective, with a single piece of leather forming the upper and a separate piece for the sole. These shoes were designed to be repaired multiple times, with new soles attached as needed, making them a long-lasting investment for families with limited resources. For particularly wet or muddy conditions, peasants might wear wooden clogs or galoshes, which provided waterproof protection for the feet. In regions where wood was plentiful, clogs became a standard form of footwear, carved from single pieces of wood and sometimes lined with straw or fabric for comfort. The headwear of working people served primarily practical purposes rather than fashion. Women typically wore simple linen coifs or kerchiefs that covered their hair completely, protecting it from dirt, dust, and sparks from cooking fires. These head coverings were essential for married women, as uncovered hair was considered improper and immodest in medieval society. Men's headwear was equally practical, with simple woolen caps or felt hats providing protection from sun, rain and cold. The shapes were basic and functional, often with brims to shield the eyes from sun or rain. For men working in particularly dangerous occupations such as blacksmithing or metalworking, leather caps might be worn to provide protection from sparks and heat. Despite their simple appearance, peasant clothing served its wearers remarkably well. The careful choice of materials, the practical construction methods, and the attention to durability created garments that could withstand the demands of medieval agricultural and artisan life, while still maintaining a sense of dignity and propriety that was important even to those at the bottom of the social hierarchy. The seasonal adaptations of peasant clothing demonstrate the ingenuity and resourcefulness of medieval working people. In winter, additional layers were added, with woolen cloaks or mantles providing crucial warmth. These outer garments were often the most expensive single item in a peasant's wardrobe, representing a significant investment that might be passed down through generations. Summer brought its own challenges, and peasant clothing adapted accordingly. Lighter weight linens replaced some woolen garments, and sleeves might be rolled up or removed entirely for the hottest work. Wide-brimmed hats became essential for field workers, providing crucial protection from the intense summer sun. The clothing of working people also reflected their specific occupations. Millers wore white clothing that showed flour dust, bakers had distinctive caps, and shepherds wore long cloaks suitable for outdoor life. These occupational variations added diversity to the seemingly uniform world of peasant dress, creating a rich tapestry of working-class fashion that reflected the complexity of medieval economic life. Rising above the peasantry in the social hierarchy, we encounter the merchant and artisan classes, groups whose clothing reflected their growing prosperity and social ambitions, while still maintaining the practical concerns of people who worked with their hands and engaged in trade. The clothing of these middle classes represents a fascinating intersection between practical necessity and social aspiration, demonstrating how fashion served as both functional tool and status symbol. Merchants, who formed the backbone of medieval commerce, needed clothing that projected prosperity and reliability, while remaining practical for travel and business dealings. A successful merchant's wardrobe was carefully calculated to inspire confidence in customers and business partners, while avoiding the ostentatious displays that might attract unwanted attention from thieves or tax collectors. The typical merchant's outfit centered around high-quality woolen garments in rich but subdued colors. Deep blues, forest greens and rich browns were particularly favoured, as these colours conveyed wealth and stability, without the flashy brightness that might be considered inappropriate for someone engaged in trade. The wool used for merchant clothing was of significantly higher quality than that used by peasants, often imported from renowned wool-producing regions like England or Flanders. Male merchants typically wore a long tunic or gown that extended to mid-calf or ankle, a length that conveyed dignity and prosperity while still allowing for comfortable movement. Over this, they might wear a surcoat, a sleeveless overgarment that added an additional layer of warmth and formality. The most prosperous merchants could afford to line these garments with fur, particularly around the collar and cuffs, adding both warmth and a clear sign of their economic success. The accessories worn by merchants were particularly telling indicators of their status and profession. Elaborate belts, often made of fine leather and decorated with metal fittings, served both practical and symbolic purposes. From these belts hung the tools of their trade: purses for carrying coins, small knives for cutting samples of cloth or breaking seals on documents, and sometimes ink horns and writing implements for recording transactions. Merchant women's clothing reflected similar values of prosperity tempered with practicality. Their dresses were made of fine wool or sometimes silk, cut with more sophisticated tailoring than peasant garments, but still designed for the active life of a woman involved in family business affairs. The sleeves might be fitted more closely to the arm, and the bodice shaped to flatter the figure while still maintaining the modesty required by medieval social conventions. The colours available to merchant women were significantly broader than those accessible to peasants, including costly dyes that produced rich purples, deep reds, and vibrant blues. However, merchant families were careful to avoid colours or styles that might be restricted by sumptuary laws to the nobility, navigating the complex regulations that governed who could wear what in medieval society. Artisans and craftsmen developed clothing traditions that reflected both their specific trades and their growing prosperity as skilled workers became increasingly valued in medieval economic life. Each craft guild often developed distinctive clothing styles that identified members of the profession, while also serving practical functions related to their work. Blacksmiths and metalworkers, for example, wore leather aprons and caps that provided protection from sparks and heat. But these practical garments were often made from high-quality leather and could be quite decorative when worn for guild ceremonies or special occasions. The leather was frequently dyed in rich colours and sometimes tooled with elaborate patterns that demonstrated the craftsman's skill and prosperity. Textile workers, including weavers, dyers, and cloth finishers, often wore garments that showcased their professional skills. A master weaver might wear cloth of his own production, demonstrating his abilities to potential customers. Similarly, dyers often wore clothing in particularly rich or unusual colours that advertised their expertise with various dye stuffs and techniques. The clothing of skilled craftsmen also reflected the complex social relationships within medieval guilds. Apprentices wore simpler versions of their master's clothing, often in cheaper materials or with fewer decorative elements. Journeymen, having completed their apprenticeships but not yet achieved master status, wore clothing that fell between these extremes, marking their intermediate position in the craft hierarchy. Master craftsmen, as established professionals and often wealthy business owners, could afford clothing that rivaled that of merchants in quality and richness. Their garments might be made from imported fabrics and decorated with elaborate embroidery or metalwork that demonstrated not only their wealth, but also their connections to the broader networks of medieval trade and craftsmanship. The wives of successful artisans and merchants occupied a particularly interesting position in medieval fashion. While they were expected to dress in a manner that reflected their family's prosperity, they also needed to avoid appearing to challenge the social hierarchy that placed noble women at the apex of fashionable display. This balance was achieved through the careful selection of rich, but not ostentatious fabrics, elegant but not revolutionary cuts, and accessories that suggested wealth without proclaiming it too boldly. The seasonal wardrobes of merchant and artisan families were significantly more extensive than those of peasants, reflecting both their greater wealth and their need to maintain appearances year-round. Winter brought out heavy woolen cloaks lined with fur, often featuring elaborate clasps and closures made of precious metals. Summer required lighter fabrics and more varied styles, as these families could afford multiple garments for different seasons and occasions. The homes of prosperous merchants and master craftsmen also influenced their clothing needs. Unlike peasants who lived in simple one-room dwellings, these families often owned houses with multiple rooms, including spaces specifically designated for receiving customers or guild members. This meant that their clothing needed to be suitable for semi-public display even within their own homes, leading to investment in higher quality everyday garments. The children of merchant and artisan families were dressed as miniature versions of their parents, with boys wearing small tunics and hose, while girls wore simplified versions of adult women's dresses. This practice served both practical and social functions, providing appropriate clothing while also beginning the process of social education that would prepare children for their future roles in medieval society. The footwear of the merchant and artisan classes reflected their intermediate social position. While not as elaborate as noble footwear, their shoes were made from higher quality leather than peasant shoes and often featured more sophisticated construction techniques. Pointed toes, known as poulaines, became increasingly popular among the prosperous middle classes, though the length of the points was carefully regulated by sumptuary laws to prevent merchants from adopting styles reserved for the nobility. As we ascend to the pinnacle of medieval society, we enter the magnificent world of noble court attire, where clothing transcended mere function to become an elaborate art form that expressed power, wealth, and divine favour. Noble fashion was a complex system of visual communication that reinforced social hierarchies while providing a stage for the display of unprecedented luxury and artistic achievement. At the medieval court, clothing served as a sophisticated language of power and politics. Every element of a noble's outfit was carefully chosen to convey specific messages about their rank, wealth, political affiliations, and personal taste. The fabrics alone told stories of international trade networks, with silk from China, furs from the far north, and precious stones from distant lands all combined to create garments that were literally worth fortunes. The foundation of noble women's fashion was still the linen chemise, but even this basic undergarment was transformed by luxury. Noble ladies wore chemises made from the finest linen, sometimes so delicate as to be nearly transparent, and often decorated with elaborate embroidery in silk or even gold thread. These undergarments, though rarely seen by anyone other than the wearer and her personal servants, represented a form of private luxury that reinforced the noble sense of elevated status. Over the chemise, noble women wore a series of increasingly elaborate outer garments. The cotte, the basic dress, was transformed from the simple peasant garment into a masterpiece of medieval tailoring. Made from precious fabrics like silk, velvet, or the finest wool, these dresses were cut to emphasize the female form while maintaining the modesty required by medieval social conventions. The most striking feature of noble women's fashion was the incredible length and elaborateness of the garments. Dresses with trains that extended several feet behind the wearer were common at court, serving no practical purpose other than to demonstrate that the wearer had no need to concern herself with such mundane matters as walking efficiency or keeping her clothing clean. These trains required the assistance of servants to manage, making them ultimate symbols of wealth and leisure. The sleeves of noble women's dresses were particularly elaborate, often extending far beyond the hands and sometimes trailing on the ground. These hanging sleeves, known as tippets, could be detached and replaced, allowing for different combinations of colours and fabrics within a single outfit. The sleeves themselves became canvases for elaborate decoration, featuring embroidery, precious stones, and metalwork that transformed them into wearable art. The colours available to noble women were the most vivid and expensive that medieval technology could produce. Deep purples from costly murex shells, brilliant reds from imported cochineal, and rich blues from precious lapis lazuli created a palette that literally glowed with wealth. These colours were often combined in complex patterns and designs that required the skills of master craftsmen to execute. Noble men's fashion was equally elaborate, though it followed different principles that emphasized masculine power and authority. The basic male noble outfit consisted of a long tunic or gown, often extending to the ankles, made from the finest fabrics and decorated with elaborate embroidery or appliqué work. Over this might be worn a surcoat or tabard, particularly when the wearer wished to display heraldic symbols that proclaimed his family identity and political allegiances. The fur used in noble men's clothing was particularly significant as a symbol of power and wealth. Ermine, with its distinctive white fur marked with black spots, was reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Other precious furs, including sable, marten, and fox, were used to line cloaks and trim garments, creating both warmth and unmistakable signs of elevated status. The accessories worn by noble men were as elaborate as their clothing. Elaborate belts made from precious metals and decorated with gems served both practical and ceremonial functions. From these belts hung ornate purses, decorated daggers, and sometimes small devotional objects that demonstrated the wearer's piety, as well as his wealth. The headwear of medieval nobles was particularly elaborate and served important ceremonial functions. Noble women wore a variety of complex headdresses that evolved dramatically throughout the medieval period. From simple veils held in place with metal circlets in the early medieval period, women's headwear evolved into elaborate constructions like the hennin, a tall cone-shaped headdress that could extend several feet above the wearer's head. These elaborate headdresses were more than mere fashion statements. They were architectural achievements that required careful engineering to balance properly, and often needed the assistance of servants to put on and take off. The construction of a single hennin might involve wire frameworks, padding, silk or velvet coverings, and elaborate veils that could be arranged in numerous ways to create different looks. Noble men's headwear was equally significant, ranging from simple coronets that mark their rank to elaborate crowns for royalty. Even everyday headwear for noble men was rich and decorative, featuring fine fabrics, precious metals, and sometimes gems or religious symbols that reinforced their social and political positions. The seasonal variations in noble clothing were extreme. reflecting both the practical needs of living in often cold and draughty castles and the social requirements of court life. Winter brought out the heaviest and most elaborate garments, with multiple layers of silk and wool topped by magnificent fur-lined cloaks that could weigh many pounds when fully decorated. Summer noble fashion was equally elaborate but focused on different materials and construction techniques. Fine linens and lightweight silks replaced heavier woolens, but the complexity and decoration of the garments remained constant. Summer cloaks might be made from silk rather than wool, but would still feature elaborate embroidery and precious stone decorations. The court ceremonies and special occasions provided opportunities for the most elaborate displays of noble fashion. Coronations, weddings, and religious festivals became showcases for the most expensive and artistic clothing that medieval craftsmen could create. These ceremonial garments might take months or even years to complete, and represented collaborations between multiple craftsmen, including embroiderers, goldsmiths, jewellers, and furriers. The maintenance of noble clothing required an extensive household staff dedicated to the care and preservation of these precious garments. Specialised servants were responsible for cleaning, repairing, and storing clothing, while others were tasked with helping the nobles dress in their complex multi-layered outfits. The daily ritual of dressing a medieval noble could take hours, and involved multiple servants working together to achieve the desired effect. The influence of noble fashion extended far beyond the court itself. Wealthy merchants and successful artisans attempted to emulate noble styles within the constraints of sumptuary laws, leading to a constant evolution of fashion as styles filtered down through the social hierarchy. This process of fashion diffusion created a dynamic relationship between the nobility and other social classes, with clothing serving as both a barrier and a bridge between different levels of medieval society. The fabrics and materials that form the foundation of medieval clothing were the products of sophisticated production systems that connected local craftsmen with international trade networks. Understanding these materials and their production helps us appreciate the technical achievements of medieval artisans and the economic relationships that made elaborate fashion possible. Wool was the foundation of medieval textile production, and the quality of woolen cloth varied enormously, depending on the breed of sheep, the climate where they grazed, and the skill of the textile workers who processed their fleece. The finest medieval wool came from English sheep, particularly those raised in the Cotswolds, where the climate and pasturage produced fleece of exceptional length and softness. The process of transforming raw wool into finished cloth was complex and labour-intensive, involving multiple stages that might take place in different locations and involve various specialists. After shearing, the wool was sorted by quality, with the finest fibres separated for the most expensive fabrics. The wool was then washed to remove lanolin and other impurities, a process that required careful attention to water temperature and quality. Spinning transformed the clean wool fibres into continuous yarn, a process that was revolutionised during the medieval period by the introduction of the spinning wheel. This device, which appeared in Europe during the 13th century, allowed spinners to produce yarn much more quickly and consistently than had been possible with the earlier drop spindle method. The spun yarn was then woven into cloth on looms that ranged from simple home devices to complex professional equipment operated by guild weavers. The quality and complexity of the weaving varied enormously, from simple plain weaves suitable for peasant clothing to elaborate patterns that required great skill and specialised equipment to produce. After weaving, woolen cloth often underwent additional processing to improve its quality and appearance. Fulling was a crucial process that involved washing the cloth in a solution containing natural detergents, then subjecting it to mechanical pressure and agitation that caused the wool fibres to mat together, creating a denser, warmer and more water-resistant fabric. The dyeing of woolen cloth was a specialised craft that required extensive knowledge of chemistry and technique. Different dyes required different preparation methods, and the same dye could produce different colours depending on the mordants used to fix the colour to the fibre. Woad produced various shades of blue. Madder created reds ranging from pink to deep crimson, and weld yielded yellows from pale lemon to deep gold. Linen production was equally complex, beginning with the cultivation of flax plants that required specific growing conditions and careful timing for optimal fibre quality. The harvesting and processing of flax was labour-intensive, involving multiple stages of rotting, breaking and combing that transformed the plant stems into fine fibres suitable for spinning. The finest linen came from regions with ideal growing conditions and generations of expertise in flax processing. Flemish linen was particularly prized throughout medieval Europe for its exceptional quality and fineness. The best linen was almost as valuable as silk and was used for the undergarments and household linens of the wealthy. Silk production in medieval Europe was limited but significant, with several regions developing sericulture during the later medieval period. However, the majority of silk used in European fashion was imported from Asia, arriving through complex trade networks that connected European markets with Chinese and Persian silk producers. The importation of silk involved considerable risk and expense, as the precious fabric had to travel thousands of miles through territories controlled by various rulers who might impose taxes or restrictions on trade. The high cost of transportation and the risks involved made silk one of the most expensive materials available to medieval consumers. The processing of imported silk into finished cloth required specialized skills and equipment. Silk weaving was a highly developed craft that produced fabrics ranging from simple plain weaves to complex patterns featuring gold and silver threads. The most elaborate silk fabrics, such as Byzantine brocades, were works of art that combined textile techniques with metalworking and sometimes even gem setting. The dyeing of silk required different techniques than wool dyeing, and silk's ability to take extremely bright and saturated colours made it particularly prized for ceremonial and luxury garments. The combination of silk's natural luster with brilliant dyes created fabrics that seemed to glow with inner light, making them perfect for the display of wealth and power. Hemp and nettle fibres provided alternatives to linen for those who could not afford the more expensive fabric. While coarser than linen, these plant fibres could be processed into serviceable cloth that was particularly valued for its durability and resistance to decay. Hemp cloth was commonly used for work clothing and household textiles, where strength was more important than fine appearance. The production of fur and leather for clothing involved specialized skills and considerable investment in tools and facilities. Furriers developed techniques for preparing and working with various animal pelts, creating both functional garments and luxury items that served as status symbols. The tanning of leather was a particularly complex and unpleasant process that transformed animal hides into flexible, durable material suitable for clothing, shoes and accessories. Different tanning methods produced leather with different characteristics, from soft, flexible materials suitable for fine garments to heavy, water-resistant leather used for protective clothing and footwear. The guild system that governed medieval textile production ensured quality control while also limiting access to the most profitable aspects of the trade. Master craftsmen jealously guarded their techniques and training methods, creating a system that maintained high standards while also preserving their economic advantages. The daily ritual of dressing in medieval times was a complex and meaningful process that varied dramatically according to social class, gender, and occasion. For the wealthy, dressing was an elaborate ceremony that could take hours and required the assistance of multiple servants, while for working people, the process was necessarily quick and practical, though no less important for establishing identity and social position. The morning routine for a medieval woman of noble birth began before dawn, with the assistance of her personal attendants. The process started with the most intimate garments, the linen chemise, which was carefully inspected for cleanliness and damage before being put on. The quality of this undergarment set the tone for the entire outfit, and noble women often owned multiple chemises of varying levels of luxury. Over the chemise came the next layer of undergarments, which might include linen braids for additional modesty and comfort. These garments were secured with ties and drawstrings, and their proper fitting was crucial for the smooth lines of the outer garments that would be layered on top. The hosiery was the next consideration, with silk or fine wool stockings carefully pulled up and secured with garters that were often decorative as well as functional. The stockings needed to be smooth and properly fitted to avoid unsightly wrinkles or bulges that would be visible beneath the outer garments. The process of putting on the main dress or gown was often the most complex part of the dressing ritual. These garments frequently featured elaborate lacing or button systems that required the assistance of servants to manage properly. The most fashionable dresses were designed to fit so closely that breathing was somewhat restricted, and the lacings had to be perfectly adjusted to achieve the desired silhouette. Accessories were added in careful order, beginning with the belt, which served both practical and decorative functions. From the belt might hang purses, keys, devotional objects, or small tools, each carefully chosen to complement the overall outfit while serving necessary practical functions. The final stages of dressing involved the most visible and elaborate elements: jewellery, headwear, and outer garments like cloaks or mantles. Each piece was selected to harmonise with the others, while conveying appropriate messages about the wearer's status, wealth, and personal taste. For men of the noble class, the dressing process was similarly elaborate, though it followed different conventions. The process began with the linen braids and under tunic, garments that were inspected for cleanliness and proper fit before being put on. The under tunic was particularly important, as it often showed at the neckline and sleeves of the outer garments. The hosiery for men consisted of separate stockings for each leg, often in different colours or patterns, secured to the braids or to a separate belt worn under the outer garments. The proper fitting and securing of hose was crucial, as any slipping or wrinkling would be immediately visible and considered a sign of poor grooming. The main tunic or gown was put on next with careful attention to the drape and fit of the garment. Men's tunics often featured complex sleeve arrangements that required assistance to manage properly, and the length had to be adjusted to achieve the desired appearance. Accessories for men included elaborate belts from which hung purses, daggers, and other essential items. The arrangement of these accessories was as carefully considered as their selection, with each item positioned to create the most pleasing and functional combination. For working people, the dressing process was necessarily more streamlined, but it was no less important for establishing identity and preparing for the day's activities. Peasant women began with their linen chemises, which might be their only truly clean garment, and therefore particularly precious despite their simple appearance. Over the chemise went the basic wool dress or cotte, a garment that had to serve multiple functions throughout the day. The dress was secured with a belt that also served as a tool belt, holding the various implements needed for household and agricultural work. The apron was an essential element that was put on after the dress was properly arranged. This garment served both protective and practical functions, shielding the dress from stains and damage, while providing convenient storage for small tools and gathered items like eggs or herbs. Footwear for working people was put on with particular care, as shoes or boots were expensive items that needed to last as long as possible. The proper fitting and securing of footwear was crucial for people who spent long hours on their feet engaged in physical labour. The seasonal variations in dressing routines were significant, particularly for people who worked outdoors. Winter mornings required additional layers of wool clothing, with cloaks and mantles serving as essential protection against cold and wind. The process of adding and securing these outer garments was an important skill that could mean the difference between comfort and misery during long days of outdoor work. Summer dressing involved different considerations, with lighter fabrics and fewer layers allowing for better ventilation and cooling. However, protection from the sun was equally important, requiring wide-brimmed hats and long sleeves that could be rolled up or down as conditions changed. The evening undressing routine was equally important, particularly for the wealthy who owned multiple changes of clothing. Garments had to be carefully removed, inspected for damage, and properly stored to preserve their condition and appearance. This process might involve brushing, airing, and careful folding or hanging of each item. The care and maintenance of medieval clothing was a continuous process that required constant attention. Garments had to be regularly inspected for wear, stains, and damage, with repairs made immediately to prevent further deterioration. The investment represented by medieval clothing, particularly for the wealthy, made proper care essential for maintaining both the garments and the social status they represented. The seasonal adaptations of medieval clothing demonstrate the ingenuity and resourcefulness of people who had to cope with changing weather conditions using only natural materials and traditional techniques. The successful management of seasonal clothing changes was essential for health, comfort, and social acceptability throughout the medieval period. Winter preparations began well before the onset of cold weather, with households engaging in elaborate preparations to ensure adequate warmth and protection during the harsh months ahead. The process of preparing winter clothing was a major household activity that might begin in late summer, with the gathering and preparation of materials. The foundation of winter warmth was the layering system that allowed medieval people to adjust their insulation according to changing conditions. Additional linen undergarments provided a base layer that could wick moisture away from the skin while providing extra insulation. These extra layers were particularly important for people who worked outdoors in cold conditions. Woolen garments were modified for winter use through various techniques that increased their warmth and weather resistance. Additional layers of wool might be sewn inside tunics and dresses, creating built-in insulation that added warmth without bulk. Sleeves could be lined with fur or additional wool, providing crucial protection for hands and arms. The outer garments for winter were the most elaborate and expensive items in most medieval wardrobes. Heavy woolen cloaks and mantles, often lined with fur, provided essential protection against wind, snow, and freezing temperatures. These garments were major investments that might represent months or even years of savings for working families. fur was used extensively in winter clothing, both as lining and trim. The quality and type of fur used indicated social status, with the finest furs reserved for the wealthy, while working people made do with more common pelts like rabbit or sheepskin. Even modest amounts of fur trim could significantly improve the warmth and weather resistance of wool garments. Footwear for winter required special consideration, as wet or frozen feet could quickly become dangerous in medieval conditions. Winter shoes were often lined with wool or fur, and additional protective coverings like leather gaiters helped keep feet dry and warm. Wooden clogs provided waterproof protection in muddy or slushy conditions. Headwear became particularly important in winter, as the head was a major source of heat loss. Woolen caps and hoods, often lined with fur, provided essential protection, while veils and other head coverings for women were adapted with additional layers for warmth. Spring brought its own challenges as medieval people navigated the transition from heavy winter clothing to lighter spring garments. The unpredictable weather of spring required clothing that could be easily adjusted or layered as conditions changed throughout the day. The process of transitioning from winter to spring clothing was gradual, with the heaviest outer garments being stored away first, while lighter cloaks and mantles remained readily available for cool mornings and evenings. The timing of this transition was crucial, as putting away winter clothing too early could result in discomfort or even danger during late cold snaps. Spring also brought the annual cycle of clothing maintenance and repair that prepared garments for the active seasons ahead. Winter clothing was cleaned, repaired, and carefully stored, while lighter garments were brought out, inspected, and prepared for use. This process was a major household activity that might take weeks to complete properly. Summer clothing had to balance the need for protection from sun and heat, with the requirement for ventilation and cooling. Lightweight linen garments became essential, providing cooling comfort while still maintaining the modesty and protection required by medieval social conventions. The colours chosen for summer clothing were carefully considered for their practical as well as aesthetic properties. Light colours reflected heat and sunlight, providing natural cooling, while darker colours were avoided except in situations where they were required by social convention or occupational necessity. Wide-brimmed hats and head coverings became essential accessories for summer wear, providing crucial protection from intense sunlight. These items were often made from lightweight materials like linen or straw, designed to provide maximum protection with minimum weight and heat retention. The management of summer clothing required different techniques than winter garments. Frequent washing became necessary due to increased perspiration, requiring households to maintain larger supplies of undergarments and lighter outer garments to allow for regular cleaning cycles. Autumn brought the need to prepare once again for winter, while making the most of the moderate temperatures and beautiful weather of the harvest season. This was often the time for major clothing purchases and preparations, as households used the income from harvest sales to invest in new garments and materials. The autumn preparation cycle included not only the acquisition of new clothing, but also the repair and modification of existing garments. Sleeves might be lengthened, additional linings sewn in, and worn areas reinforced in preparation for the heavy wear of winter conditions. The storage and preservation of seasonal clothing was a crucial skill that determined how long expensive garments would last. Proper storage required protection from moths, moisture, and other sources of damage, with aromatic herbs and careful folding techniques used to preserve the condition of stored garments. The social aspects of seasonal clothing changes were as important as the practical considerations. The transition from winter to spring clothing was often a public announcement of changing seasons and renewed social activity, while the adoption of summer fashions marked the beginning of the active social season for the wealthy. The special garments and accessories that completed medieval outfits were often the most distinctive and memorable elements of historical fashion. These items served functions that went far beyond mere decoration, acting as symbols of status, occupation, religious devotion, and personal identity in ways that were immediately recognizable to medieval observers. Headwear held particular significance in medieval society, serving functions that extended far beyond simple protection from the elements. For women, head coverings were essential markers of marital status, social rank, and moral character. Unmarried young women might wear their hair uncovered, or with simple ribbons and circlets, while married women were expected to cover their hair completely as a sign of modesty and respectability. The variety of women's head coverings was remarkable, ranging from simple linen veils to elaborate architectural constructions that required engineering skills to create and wear successfully. The wimple, a cloth covering that wrapped around the chin and neck, was particularly popular among married women of all social classes during certain periods, providing both modesty and a distinctive feminine silhouette. The evolution of women's headwear throughout the medieval period reflects changing fashion trends and social attitudes. The elaborate headdresses of the later medieval period, such as the hennin with its towering cone shape and flowing veils, represented the pinnacle of medieval fashion engineering, requiring wire frameworks and careful construction to achieve their dramatic effects. Men's headwear was equally significant, though it followed different conventions that emphasized masculine authority and occupational identity. Simple woolen caps served working men for everyday wear, while more elaborate hats indicated higher social status or special occupations. Scholars wore distinctive caps that identified their learned status, while merchants might wear broad-brimmed hats that provided both practical protection and social identification. The materials used for headwear varied dramatically according to social status and available resources. Peasant head coverings were made from simple linen or wool, while noble headdresses incorporated silk, precious metals, gems, and elaborate embroidery. The most expensive headwear represented significant investments, comparable to major pieces of jewellery. Footwear in medieval society was far more varied and sophisticated than is often recognised, with different styles serving different social, occupational, and practical needs. The basic medieval shoe was a simple but effective design that provided protection and durability while remaining relatively easy to manufacture and repair. The evolution of medieval footwear reflects both technological advances and changing fashion preferences. Early medieval shoes were simple affairs made from single pieces of leather, but later periods saw the development of more complex construction techniques that allowed for better fit, greater durability, and more elaborate decoration. The pointed shoes known as poulaines became particularly fashionable during the later medieval period, with the length of the points serving as indicators of social status. The most extreme examples featured points so long that they had to be tied to the wearer's legs to prevent tripping, making them clear symbols of leisure and wealth that were impractical for any form of physical labour. The social regulation of footwear through sumptuary laws demonstrates its importance as a status symbol. Different classes were restricted to different lengths of points on their shoes, with the longest points reserved for the highest nobility. These regulations were taken seriously, and violations could result in significant penalties. Women's shoes followed different conventions than men's footwear, with considerations of modesty and practicality influencing their design. Since women's feet were rarely seen beneath long skirts, women's shoes were often simpler and more practical than men's elaborate footwear. Though wealthy women certainly owned shoes made from fine materials and decorated with embroidery or metalwork, belts and pouches served crucial practical functions while also acting as important fashion accessories and status symbols. The medieval belt was far more than a simple waist cinch. It was a portable tool rack, jewellery display and identity marker, all combined into a single essential accessory. The construction of medieval belts varied dramatically according to their intended use and the wealth of their owners. Simple leather belts served working people for everyday use, while elaborate examples made from precious metals and decorated with gems were worn by nobility for ceremonial occasions. The items suspended from medieval belts tell fascinating stories about daily life and social priorities. Keys indicated authority over household management, purses displayed wealth and commercial activity, knives served numerous practical functions, and devotional objects demonstrated religious piety. The combination and arrangement of these items created a personal signature that identified the wearer as clearly as their clothing. Pouches and purses were particularly important accessories that served both practical and symbolic functions. The size, material, and decoration of a purse indicated the owner's wealth and social status, while the way it was worn and displayed conveyed messages about the wearer's occupation and priorities. Jewellery in medieval society served functions that extended far beyond personal decoration, acting as portable wealth, religious symbols, and markers of social relationships and political alliances. The wearing of jewellery was carefully regulated by social convention and sumptuary laws that determined who could wear what types of ornaments. The types of jewellery available to medieval people varied enormously according to their social status and economic means. Working people might own simple bronze or pewter brooches and pins, while nobility wore elaborate pieces made from gold and silver, and set with precious stones imported from distant lands. Brooches and fibulae were among the most common and important pieces of medieval jewellery, serving the practical function of fastening clothing, while also providing opportunities for decorative display. These items range from simple utilitarian fasteners to elaborate works of art that demonstrated the owner's wealth and taste. Rings held particular significance in medieval society, serving as symbols of authority, markers of social relationships, and indicators of religious devotion. Signet rings were used to authenticate documents and transactions, while wedding rings marked marital status and religious commitment. The religious significance of medieval jewellery cannot be overstated, with many pieces serving devotional functions as well as decorative ones. Crosses, religious medallions, and pilgrim badges were worn not only as expressions of faith, but also as protective amulets believed to provide spiritual and physical protection. The care and maintenance of medieval accessories required considerable skill and attention, as these valuable items represented significant investments that needed to be preserved and protected. Special techniques were developed for cleaning different types of metals and stones, while proper storage methods prevented damage and loss. The social rituals surrounding the wearing and display of accessories were as important as the items themselves. The proper coordination of accessories with clothing, the appropriate occasions for wearing different pieces, and the social messages conveyed by various combinations all required knowledge and skill that were passed down through generations of medieval families. The evolution and legacy of medieval fashion represents one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of human creativity and social expression. The clothing traditions established during the medieval period laid foundations that continue to influence fashion, tailoring, and textile production to this day, creating connections that span nearly 1,000 years of human development. The technological innovations of medieval textile production revolutionized the way clothing was made and established techniques that remained essentially unchanged until the Industrial Revolution. The introduction of the spinning wheel, the development of more sophisticated looms, and the refinement of dyeing techniques created a foundation of textile knowledge that supported fashion development for centuries. The guild system that governed medieval textile production established patterns of professional organisation and quality control that influenced craft traditions throughout Europe and beyond. The training methods, quality standards, and business practices developed by medieval guilds created models that were adapted and modified but never completely abandoned in later periods. The social functions of medieval clothing established principles that continue to influence fashion today. The use of clothing to indicate social status, professional identity, and personal taste originated in medieval practices that created the foundation for all subsequent fashion traditions. The medieval understanding of clothing as a form of communication and social positioning remains relevant in contemporary fashion and style. The seasonal patterns of medieval clothing established rhythms of fashion, change that continue to influence the modern fashion industry. The medieval practice of maintaining separate wardrobes for different seasons and occasions created patterns of fashion consumption that evolved into the modern system of fashion seasons and regular style updates. The regional variations in medieval fashion established traditions of local style and cultural identity that continue to influence clothing traditions around the world. The medieval recognition that climate, available materials, and cultural preferences should influence clothing design created principles that remain relevant for contemporary fashion designers working in different markets and conditions. The medieval tradition of adapting basic garment patterns for different social classes and occasions established the principle of democratic fashion that allows the same basic styles to be interpreted at different price points and levels of elaboration. This medieval innovation made fashion accessible to broader populations while still maintaining distinctions based on quality and decoration. The medieval understanding of clothing as a form of personal and political expression established traditions that continue to influence how people use fashion to communicate their identities and values. The medieval practice of using clothing to make statements about religious beliefs, political affiliations, and social values created precedents that remain relevant in contemporary fashion and style. The preservation of medieval clothing and fashion knowledge through written records, artistic representations, and surviving garments has created an invaluable resource for understanding historical life and social organisation. The detailed attention paid to clothing in medieval art and literature demonstrates the central importance of fashion in medieval society and provides modern researchers with remarkable insights into historical daily life. The revival and reinterpretation of medieval fashion elements in later periods demonstrates the enduring appeal and relevance of medieval design principles. From the Gothic revival of the 19th century to contemporary historical recreation movements, medieval fashion continues to inspire and influence designers and fashion enthusiasts around the world. The modern historical recreation movement has created new appreciation for medieval fashion and textile techniques, leading to renewed interest in traditional crafts and production methods. Contemporary artisans working in historical fashion have recovered techniques that were nearly lost and have demonstrated the sophistication and beauty of medieval clothing traditions. The study of medieval fashion has contributed to broader understanding of social history, economic development, and cultural change, demonstrating how clothing and fashion serve as valuable sources of historical information. The detailed analysis of medieval fashion has revealed insights into medieval society that would not be available through other types of historical evidence. The environmental consciousness of medieval fashion, with its emphasis on durability, repairability, and multi-generational use, provides valuable lessons for contemporary fashion designers and consumers concerned about sustainability and environmental impact. The medieval practices of careful maintenance, regular repair, and adaptive reuse offer models for more sustainable approaches to fashion consumption. The global connections revealed through medieval fashion demonstrate the international scope of medieval trade and cultural exchange, showing how fashion served as a vehicle for the transmission of ideas, techniques, and materials across vast distances. The medieval fashion trade networks established patterns of international commerce that continue to influence global fashion markets today. As we conclude this journey through the rich and varied world of medieval fashion, we can appreciate how clothing served as far more than mere protection from the elements. Medieval fashion was a complex system of social communication that reflected and reinforced the hierarchical structures of feudal society while providing opportunities for personal expression, artistic creativity, and technological innovation. The legacy of medieval fashion continues to enrich our understanding of history and human creativity, reminding us that the desire for beauty, status, and self-expression through clothing is a fundamental human characteristic that transcends time and social circumstances. The medieval achievement in creating sophisticated, beautiful, and meaningful clothing from limited resources and primitive technology stands as a testament to human ingenuity and artistic vision that continues to inspire and inform fashion creation today.